Well, family, I hope you had a good week. Hope you understand that no matter what's going on around us, God's in control of it all. And we've got to learn to turn it over to Him and just trust that He is in control. Because things start to go sideways on us and we want to grab the steering wheel and bring it back around, He's in control. Let Him drive. Let Him do what He does best, and that's be God. Last week we talked about the resurrected Lord. The fact that as Jesus was buried and that big stone was rolled in front of the grave and 2 guards were put out and everyone thought it was over, and Satan was probably celebrating because Satan doesn't have the ability to see into the future. God knew what was going to happen on that Sunday. Satan didn't know. And all of a sudden that stone rolled away and Jesus came out alive and well, and He's alive and well today. And we serve a risen Savior. And so as we look at that, I want us to kind of spend a couple of weeks in looking at God's power. We saw it in the resurrection. We read about it and what happened there, but that's not the first instance, and it's certainly not the last of God's power being shown. And so I want to go back to Genesis chapter 1. I want to look a little bit there and read some scriptures there and start with the power that began it all, where God began to speak and things became existent. In Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The Genesis writer says, in the beginning God created. And that was that power that God has. That was that power that brought everything into existence that we know and that we see, that we can smell, that we can taste, that we can feel. Sometimes we talk about people creating things. An artist creates a statue, or an artist creates a painting. But they really didn't create it in the way that God created. Because God began with nothing and ended up with everything and spoke those things into being. So from nothing, these things became in existence. Day 1. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So the first day, God says, let there be light. And there was. It's not like you flip on a switch and all of a sudden PG&E sends power up to the ballast of these bulbs and they all come on. You see, you got to have it all wired correctly for that to work. You got to pay your PG&E bill to have it on, or have enough solar with battery backup that everything still works. There was nothing, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God called the light day and the darkness night. And we had day 1. Day 2, God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate the waters from water. So God made the vault and separated the waters under the vault from the waters above it. And it was so. And God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Again, God said, let this happen. And it happened. He separated the vaults, and He called the vault above sky. Day 3. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and gathered the waters and called them seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on every land that bears fruit with a seed in it, according to the various kinds. And it was so. And the land produced vegetation and plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seeds in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. when God began to speak all this into existence and all the plants and trees that he brought into life, and they're going to reproduce after their own kind, that's why you can't go down to the store, like the nursery, and buy an apple tree and plant it in your backyard expecting to get avocados off of it. It's not going to happen. Now, you might get an orange tree that produces some lemons because somebody grafted a lemon into that orange root system. And you might have 2 fruits that way, but when you take the seed of anything and plant it, what you're going to reproduce is that seed. So when you plant poppies, you're going to get poppies. When you plant tomatoes, you're going to get tomatoes. You're not going to get chili peppers. God started that from speaking it into existence on day 3. The land was formed. The waters were separated. He called the waters sea. He called the dry ground land. And he formed and created all the vegetation around us that will continue to reproduce after its kind. On day 4, God said, "Let there be lights in the vaulted sky to separate the day from the night. And let them serve as signs to mark the sacred times and days and years. And let them be lighted in the vaults of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 greater lights. The greater light was to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. And he also made the stars. And God said to the vaulted skies to give the light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate the light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. So on the 4th day, here he begins to decide with the lights. And he creates the sun, and he creates the moon, and he puts all the stars out there. And he separates the day and the night. And he calls the sunlight daytime, and the night with the moon and the stars. And I don't know, living in the valley most of my life, you look up in the sky and you see some stars up there. The family, you need to go up in the mountains, above the smog line, where the sky is clear, and see the stars. And you realize how many millions and millions and millions there are, just shining and twinkling all over the place. And just think about God created those stars. God created that moon. God created that sun and spoke it into existence. On day 5, God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the vaulted sky." And so God created the great creatures of the sea, every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. So the 5th day, God speaks into being all the fish and all the sea life and all the aquatic animals. And he speaks into being the birds of the air that fly around. And he tells them the same thing he did with the plants. Be fruitful and multiply. And they multiplied after their own kinds. Again, you didn't have cows having horses, and you didn't have sheep having goats. You didn't have dogs having cats. You didn't have whales giving birth to bass. They produced after their own kind. Day 6. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, and each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the wild animals according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kind, and all creatures that move along the ground according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. I want to stop there for a minute. So on day 6, God begins by speaking into existence all the animals on the land. And he says to the animals the same thing he said to the fish, the same thing he said to the birds, the same thing he did with the plants. I want you to reproduce. I want you to grow. I want you to create of your kind. And all of those animals came into existence because God said, let it be so. So all the way through the middle of day 6, God has spoken everything that you know around you into existence. His power is being displayed. His power of taking nothing and making something. And then he says, let us make man in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. And in his image, God created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fishes of the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then God said, and I will bless every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seeds in it. They will be your food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give everything green plants for food. And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. No. He says he saw everything, and it was very good. You see, at the end of every day, it was good. At the end of the 6th day, when he was done with his creation, it was very good. And in chapter 2, when it goes into a little bit more detail in this creation, it talks about him getting down and forming man out of the dust of the earth and breathing into us the breath of life. And I always found it interesting that everything that's around you, the trees, the animals, the fish, the seas, the land, the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, everything that you can see, everything that you can feel, everything that you taste, everything that you touch, God spoke into being. God said, and it was so. But when it got down to us, when it got down to the ones he created in his own image, it was like he took a little bit more time. He didn't just speak man and woman into being. He created us by molding us from the dust of the earth and by breathing into us the breath of life. You see, we were created in his image. The animals weren't. The plants weren't. The trees weren't. The sky wasn't. The sun wasn't. The water and the land. But mankind, man and woman, was created in the image of God. It was like his final act of creative power in forming us and breathing into us his spirit, his breath of life, and bringing us into existence. You can't get more powerful than that. To start off the entire Bible with showing and displaying the power of God that created everything around you. That's the same power that we experienced last week in looking at the grave when that stone was rolled away. You see, the power of God is one of those things that you just can't have once. It's going to come back over and over and over. As we go through the Old Testament and go into the New Testament, you continue to see God's power. And it's not something that has stopped today. It's not something that ended with Christ coming from the grave. It continues. That's what we want to kind of get into as we go through this series. I've got to be careful because I'm used to going to about 11, and we started earlier, so I got to kind of watch that. I don't want to keep you here till 11. You might go to sleep on me. So God's creative power. John talked about it in 1 John chapter 1 when he said that Christ, Jesus, was there too. When God was speaking things into being, it was the word that was flowing from his lips. And John says, in the beginning was the word, And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light that shines into darkness, the darkness has not overcome it. And down in verse 14 he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In this creative force, you see the Father, you see the Son, you see the Spirit as this creation comes about. And John says Jesus was there from the beginning. Jesus wasn't something that was created. He was part of the creative force. He was part of the creation. He was one of those creating. He didn't just all of a sudden pop into existence. He had been there before all of this began, and he was part of this creation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we realize that as we continue to follow Jesus. And as we go on through, and I'm just going to hit these as a highlight, I want you to just kind of think back in your memory bank of stories that you've read and stories that you've studied. Some of the things that God displayed his power. Things that when you read about it and you understand it and you believe it with knowing that it was written by the Spirit of God, the hand of God, through these 40 men over the time that they wrote from Genesis to Revelation, that God is the one that's displaying his power, that there's no doubt that it was God. Noah and the flood. You know, when you read the first 6 chapters of Genesis, they really didn't know what rain was. It appears that it never had really rained before, but God caused rain to happen so strong that the entire world was flooded. And yet he saved Noah, his 3 sons, their wives, and the animals in an ark. Moses, when Moses was sent back to release the Israelite nation, and God showed up and showed in 10 different plagues his power. If you remember, the Egyptians and magicians tried to stay up with him for a while. You know, Moses caused the river to turn to blood. Well, they could do that too. You know, they caused this water to turn into blood. But there was a point in time when they couldn't keep trying to replicate what God was doing. Because God's God, and they weren't. And the power of God continued to show until they got to that 10th plague, when he took the life of every firstborn in all of Egypt, except for those who had the blood on their doorpost. They passed over those homes, passed over those fields. Egyptians allowed the Israelite nation to leave. And they're going out and they're headed out, and all of a sudden they see the army behind them. And they get here, and here's the Red Sea is in front of them, and the army's behind them. What do we do now? God showed up, demonstrated his power again, separated the waters out, dried the ground, and allowed them to pass over the Red Sea on dry ground. Didn't need a bridge, didn't have to call in a crew to decide what to do and take 5 years to investigate it. God separated the waters, showing his power again over nature. And as soon as they were over and the Egyptian army was in the sea, he allowed the waters to go back where they were and took out the entire army. When they crossed over the river Jordan into the promised land, again he separated the waters, allowed them to pass on dry land. When they went up to take over the city of Jericho, here's this city with these huge walls. They're really thick, tall, strong walls. And all they did was march around like God told them to. And it said on that 7th day and the 7th time when they blew the trumpets, the walls fell, and they fell flat. Something that just wouldn't happen. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't the ground moving. It was God showed up again with his power. When Gideon was victorious with only 300 men over an army of thousands, it wasn't because Gideon was an expert soldier. It wasn't because the 300 guys were the best shots ever. It was because God was there. David and Goliath. Here's this young 17-year-old kid taking on Goliath, who is a 9-foot-plus tall soldier. Had all the armor on that he could possibly need. Had a sword probably bigger than David was. David wasn't afraid of Goliath. David grabbed 5 stones and had a slingshot and ran towards Goliath. Because David knew something that Goliath didn't know, that God was right with him. And that the power of God was going to show up again just like he has time and time and time before. And he said, "Come on, Goliath, I'll take you on." And with 1 stone in that slingshot, brought him down, killed him. It wasn't because David was that good with that slingshot. Because he knew who was behind him. The power of God. It goes without saying that our God is unstoppable. His power, His might, His ability is unstoppable.